spent most of my career studying women's sexual behavior and relationship psychology. And it was sort of a natural extension of some research interests that I've had in terms of looking at women's sexual double standards that we have for women, where it's like we think that it's okay for men to do something, but then it's not okay for women. And we get this a lot with like casual sex, like the whole idea being that it's okay if men have casual sex, but like if women do it, we have a
Mhm.
whole list of terms that we tend to call them. And so age gap dating is also another one of these areas where there's a real double standard in terms of the way that we treat women dating younger and then men dating younger. And so I started doing some research on this, and then I started doing some consulting work for Cougar Life. And Cougar Life is it's a dating application. So it's like a dating app for women who are seeking younger partners and men who are seeking older partners. And so I've been working with them to like further my research in this field and just trying to better understand, what are the nature of these relationships? Do they work? How are they different from non-age gap relationships? And what are these double standards that we have? And, to what extent do we penalize women for dating younger partners?
I have some very strong feelings about this, but before I go into that, what did the data say? What's your research say about these
Well,
things?
well, to start with, there is a double standard in terms of our sort of
No doubt.
thresholds for acceptability when it comes to age gap dating. And generally, when we're talking about age gap dating, we're talking about partnerships where there's about a 10 or more year age difference between in a heterosexual couple, between a man and a woman.
Mhm.
And what we find is that when men are involved in, dating younger partners, we don't have any sort of predatory sounding labels we just call these guys men.
Mm.
And the research finds that people view these relationships as being a lot more socially acceptable than what is found when it comes to women dating younger. And so I
Mm.
did worked with Cougar Life and Ipsos to do a poll of Americans, where we just took a random sample of 1,000 Americans and asked about their, is it okay for an older man to date somebody who's 10 or more years younger? Is it okay for a woman to do the same thing? And what we find is that there's like a 10% differential between the degree to which we think the one thing is acceptable versus the other. And we tend to be much more accepting of men dating younger than we do women. What's also really interesting about this, and it'd be interesting to see whether this surprises you, because the idea that we frown upon these relationships more with women than we do with men isn't surprising. And I think all women, like when we hear that, we just sort of have to nod,
Yeah.
because anytime that we do anything that has to do with, sex or pleasure, it's seen as being sort of dangerous, and where we don't feel that with men. But what
Mhm.
is also really interesting about this, and we also find this with other forms of sexual double standards that we have for women, is that the people who are most judgmental about these relationships isn't men, right? It's other women.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
the people who are generally disapproving of these relationships, it tends to be coming from other women. And so we
Yeah.
tend to think about these sort of boxes that we get put in as women. Like what's okay and what's not okay, and like what you can't wear that because it'll make you look this way, it'll make you look like you're sexually motivated, or you can't have casual relationships, or you can't date younger. We tend to think about that we're being put in these boxes by men and like the patriarchy. But what the data tend to find is that like other women are the patriarchy. It's
Well,
like,
well, that's I was just about to say the patriarchy, that is still a patriarchy. It still affects us in different ways, conditioning women to think this specific way, that it's okay for men to have this sexual gratification, but not for women, and
right,
that we
yeah,
are here for their pleasure, which is infuriating, really. Yeah.
right. Well, yeah, and it's really interesting that, in that type of a context, the people that we tend to punish are the women,
Yeah,
you know,
of
by saying
course. I
like,
mean, of
it's
course.
yeah, it's not like, oh, men shouldn't be using women sexually, and just, sort of having sex with them and, and casting them aside. Instead, we tend to penalize in women for
Yeah,
doing these things. And I think that sometimes it's so reflexive, for women to be judgmental about other women's behaviors that we don't even think about it. And then when you are confronted with it and somebody says, like, hey, the research shows that when it comes to people disapproving of women having, pursuing sexual pleasure, that it's women who are the ones who are, sort of the really beating the
judgmental.
drum of this isn't appropriate. I think that it's eye-opening for women, because I think that, I mean, even for me, when I was looking at that, I was like, "Oh my gosh," like, this is terrible that women are the ones who are, putting or judging other women's behaviors as being unacceptable. But then I think about it and I'm like, "No, that I've done that. I've done that. I've
It
totally
makes
done
sense,
that."
yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, and I don't think that we intentionally mean to. I
yeah.
think that it's something that I don't know, in some ways, I think it's because we've bought into our own, like, cultural ideology about what is okay and not okay for women to do and believe.